there's always a way it boils down to these people. Some form of these people. There's a discussion that I've been wanting to have, an observation that I've been noticing, and it's something that I think needs to be talked about, and it's not just a thing that happens with people on the right, it happens with people on the left too. Though most of my examples are probably going to be on the right. That is what I generally criticize, so we'll get into that here in a second. First, as always, though, the fan art section. We have the completion of Dio Suris. Lord Suris, as they say. Lord Suris, we bow down upon your throne. We will do anything to serve you. We shall... Oh my god. We'll take out Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro using the ultimate card, Zewardo! Now I'll use my stand, the world! Oh my god. I finished JoJo's Part 3 like 2 months ago? Perfect timing. Perfect timing. I can get the memes now. This one is from Kidder Doodles. It's some doodles of a hunting Suris. Really liked the glaive in Chrono Cross, so I decided to sketch it out. The thoughts behind this one, lightweight for mobility, but a bit more central coverage for defense. Dagger on the thigh, because why the fuck not? And a hammer hair charm. When happy, when angry. When happy, when angry. The next one we have is from Artsy OT. Did a doodle of a buff male Nekosaurus for drawing practice while I am recovering from the Rona. As always, these are all awesome. Thank you all for your fan art submissions. If you want your fan art to be shown in a future episode, the best way to do so is to drop them into the fan art section of the Discord. With that said, I want to go ahead and get the discussion going. Have any of you noticed, with a lot of activism of various types, there's a toxic type of it that tends to manifest, where it stops being about the logic of your positions, and it just starts being about the enemies you can make. It just starts being about the people you don't like. Has anybody noticed stuff like this? As example, take people who are anti-masks. What's the actual reason to hate masks? They're inconvenient, sure. I hate wearing them. They trigger my allergies really badly because they tend to trap bits of animal hair in them, which is why I can't use cloth masks I keep in the house. I have to use disposables when I need to use them. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't like wearing them. The purpose is not to enjoy wearing them, generally. The purpose is to help other people around you. I don't see any issue with wearing them, and yet there are people who hate them and have almost started defining aspects of themselves with their hatred of them. I've even heard people mention that they've denied taking on construction jobs from people who commissioned them while in masks. Now, the veracity of these claims, I don't know. If you've ever been around Southern people in Georgia, a lot of people have a tendency to exaggerate their claims. So I just wanted to relay that these are things that I've heard while being around and about in real life. You know, the place where you touch the grass and the people breathe. What's the actual logic behind that position? What's the actual logic behind it? Because I don't see any. I can't think of a single reason to hold an actual anti-mask position. Not just being against mask mandates. That's one thing. I can't understand being against other people wearing them. And yet we've seen from people like Ron DeSantis where he's ripped a mask off a kid and told him not to wear it in his presence. Like, shit like that? Why? What's the logic? Or with trans people. What's the logic behind removing their rights? Like, what's the actual logic? Or is it just defining yourself against trans people? Think of the average TERF. So much of their time and rhetoric gets dedicated into hating trans people or trying to strip trans people of their ability to enter the bathrooms they want to, their ability to get needed medical procedures, their ability to play in sports. What is the actual logic behind that? What are you defending? The argument is always, oh, well, we're defending women's spaces, but those spaces were still women's spaces the whole time. one, trans women are women, and two, trans women are pretty rare. Trans men are pretty rare too. It's you don't encounter them every day except for online. So how really inconvenienced were you that one day out of the year, maybe you went into a bathroom and there was a trans person there? One day out of the year, maybe a trans person came into your favorite bar at the exact time that you did. How often did that actually happen in your life and inconvenience you? Because it's not just it happening, it's also it happening and you knowing, so much so that you actually got inconvenienced by it. How much does it inconvenience you that a trans person went and got a surgery or got hormones that they needed for them to be happier with their own bodies? How much did it affect you that they did that? For most people, it really doesn't affect their lives outside of the amount that people they look up to tell them it affects their lives. And generally speaking, the amount of times they've actually been inconvenienced by this thing is so astronomically rare that when they are inconvenienced by it, or at least they perceive they're inconvenienced by it, they then define so much of their lives around it. What's the logic behind that? I don't think there actually is any. I think it's just blatant tribalism. That's all it is. When gay people weren't allowed to marry, what was the actual reason behind that? What did a gay person getting a marriage do against you? If you were a straight person in a straight marriage, the argument that I heard all the time when I was growing up was that it destroyed the sanctity of marriage. But how? Marriage is an individual thing, had on an individual basis. In what ways were you so involved with a random gay person's marriage whom you can't even name that it somehow affected yours? That the mere existence of other people wanting the same legal rights that you had access to, how did that actually inconvenience you? How was that actually a problem for you? I mean, I would argue it probably wasn't ever at any point, but somebody told you it was. Your preacher probably told you it was. Your favorite podcaster probably told you it was. That dude you listen to on YouTube that talks really fast and owns all the liberals on a college campus, that he probably told you. He probably told you that it was a bad thing. Or, you know, that other dude that wears gun holsters all the time despite having no logical reason to wear them besides his own shredded masculinity. He probably told you. But why did you care besides that? What was the reason? I can't think of one, but somehow we live in the world where people fought against gay rights as much as they could, and still do. Rewind the clock back a little bit, and you'll find people who were against miscegenation. There were people who were against people of different races being allowed to marry, being allowed to have kids together. What was the reason for that? What was the actual reason for that? And there are people now who are still against miscegenation, and they can't give you a logical reason. They'll say things like, "Oh, well, we're just trying to keep white blood pure," or, you know, people actually get along more when they're with people who look like them. So we shouldn't encourage racial mixing because that just destroys the nuclear family, or some dumb shit. Stuff that never really makes any sense because they probably get along with a black person or an Asian person just fine. And yet somehow magically, they think that there was something wrong with dating somebody like that. Where was the logic in that? I can't see any. Don't think there ever was any. Or how about when we talk about homeless people? When we set up hostile architecture to try to force them out of certain areas. What's the actual logic in that? As far as I can see, there is an actual logic there. The solution would be to get those homeless people off the streets, not throw them to some other streets that you haven't yet put spikes on. And yet, somehow, magically, that's not the consideration that's had. It's always about inconveniencing them, hurting them. The solution to really loud trans people on the internet has always been to just give them the rights that they've been wanting. The solution to people inconveniencing you with gay marriages and miscegenation is to normalize those things. They cease being inconvenient to you at that point. With accusations of election fraud, it's not really that there's actual reasonable suspicion that there's election fraud. It's about demonizing people you don't like. People don't like Democrats, especially here in the South. So go ahead and throw up suspicion to the election. That will prevent you from being inconvenienced by your other. There's always a way it boils down to these people. Some form of these people. If these people weren't allowed to compete in sports, then sports would be more fair. If these people weren't seen on the streets, then the place would look cleaner. If these people weren't getting married, then my marriage would somehow be better, and my wife wouldn't be leaving me because I'm a hateful shit. If these people weren't wearing masks, I wouldn't have to feel guilty for not wearing one. If these people cheated for their election, then we don't have to publicly acknowledge a democracy and what it's done. It ousted our favorite person, but we can pretend that that's not actually an issue if these people cheated. I think a good exercise to engage in would be to recognize when it's not about logic. It's about othering. It's about the fantasy of having an enemy and the other fantasy of protecting something sacred. And you get this issue in the atheist community too. Some of the more anti-theist of the bunch, of which I could be considered in a lot of ways, define themselves against the other. The other is people who have a religion or people who believe a God exists. All the terrors in the world are just because people believe in God. But the more that you look into people's individual beliefs, you find that people use religion many times as a scapegoat for bigotry, not the actual reason. Religion was used as a scapegoat from somebody in my family years ago to argue against miscegenation. Religion was used as a scapegoat from people I knew years ago to argue against gay marriage. But it was never actually the reason. It was always that gay marriage was a change, and that was uncomfortable, and religion was a nice, comfortable scapegoat that you could blame for your bigotry. I think it may be a good idea when anti-theists in my crowd would look at situations and actually be able to ascertain when religion or when God belief is the cause or merely a shield being used because it's convenient. This is a problem people fall into a lot. Remember, every single person I've listed will say that what they are engaging in is about logic. It's about personal freedom with masks. It's about protected categories with trans people. It's about the sanctity of marriage with gay people. It is about keeping society stable with anti-miscegenation laws. It is about keeping our streets clean when they put spikes on benches and shit for homeless people. It is about stopping people from hurting others with religion as a shield. Until you get to the point where you start generalizing so much that it stops being about anything and it starts just being about the fantasy of having an enemy. Life is a lot more simple when you have an enemy. And that fantasy of having an enemy allows you to engage in the fantasy of protecting something sacred. For anti-theists, that sacred thing might be logic. For somebody who's anti-miscegenation, that sacred thing might just be white people or some shit. It doesn't matter, because the sacred thing is fictitious. Nothing is sacred. And I think the sooner we realize that, the sooner we'll stop engaging in the fantasy of fighting our enemies and actually do some good. Till then, I'm going to continue to argue against things that I feel are harmful. Statements and sayings and people who I think are causing active harm. But I think engaging in generalizations allows us to create enemies that aren't really there. And this is really bad when we're dealing with enemies that we know have done horrible things, and yet we start making up things that they've done over on top of that. There is no need for that. Don't make up an enemy. So I've said it before, and I'll say it again. In a lot of these situations, it feels like it stops being about logic, and it just starts being about this fantasy. And I don't think that's productive. I don't think that's useful. But let me know in the comment section below. I'm sure you probably have thoughts, and maybe I've said something that you vehemently disagree with. By all means, let me know in the comment section below. I invite discussion. As always, everyone, if you want to support my channel and what I do, you know how to do so. Insert end of video tagline here.